space heating for our buildings and heating of water. In total, Scotland uses around 175 terawatt hours. Now, what's a terawatt hour? Try not to go into too much jargon. Let's just run this one through. 1 terawatt hour is 1,000 gigawatt hours. 1 gigawatt hour is 1,000 megawatt hours. 1 megawatt hour is 1,000 kilowatt hours. Now, a kilowatt hour might be something you recognise. It's what it takes to boil the kettle. So, 1 terawatt hour is 1 billion kettles boiling for an hour. It's a lot of energy, and we use 175 of those a year. So it's a big system. Now, I should have said this before those numbers. David Mackay, the new chief scientist at DEC, you may have heard of his book, Sustainable Energy Without the Hot Air. He encourages us in the introduction to that to cut emissions of twaddle and to get to the numbers, because he thinks there's an awful lot of generalities spoken, and I'm sure I'll do some of that tonight, but I'm also going to try to use numbers, and I hope I'm not going to drown you in numbers as we go along. So, the research that the Power Scotland Secured is based on by Garrad Hassan sets out some scenarios, and we start with demand now in Scotland for electricity is about 41 terawatt hours. We generate about 12 more, and that gets exported, so 53 gets generated. The scenarios we looked at allowed the prospect of demand growing. Now, we think that's highly unlikely, and I'll say why in a moment, but also the prospect of demand being managed down through efficiency and conservation measures. So the scenarios range from a base demand between 34 and 46 terawatt hours, with an additional demand on top of that for not on a like-for-like basis. For new uses for electricity, particularly for running vehicles. So electric vehicles, electric cars are seen as a very likely scenario in that time period. It's also seen, which will seem odd to those who've gone through the period when we stopped using electricity to heat our homes and turned to gas, but it seems quite likely that we will turn back to using electricity for heating our homes in new ways. And in this study, we've made an allowance for a very substantial shift in both of those sectors that would generate a demand for about 7 to 9 terawatt hours more electricity. The reason we think, though, that the core scenario is likely to be around about stable demand is that growth from vehicles and heat will be offset by better demand management in existing uses. So more efficient appliances, more efficient lighting, and so forth. The Scottish Government recently adopted a fairly ambitious target of cutting the overall amount of energy used, that's end use total, including the heat and transport bits, by 12% by 2020. That actually implies a rate that is higher than the most ambitious demand reduction scenario in this work. So the lower baseline, we think, is fairly plausible. We also looked at 2 broad renewable scenarios. One, continuing about the current rate of additions of supply, though that's an average rather than a specific year figure, and the other based on a set of analysis of what was in the pipeline. And I'll come back to why those are realistic in just a moment. So, what are those renewables? Well, the main contributor will be new wind farms, and there will be a significant amount onshore, plus a growing amount offshore. Now, this might look like a lot, that we go from a current capacity of 2,000 megawatts to, in a low renewable scenario, nearly 7,000 megawatts by 2030. But that is based primarily on what is already in the development system, and it's not based on all of them getting approval. It's not even based on the current success rate, which is around 66%. It's based on a success rate of 20% to get to that low renewables scenario, and a success rate of 26% to get to the high one. So more conservative stuff in here. I mean, I sometimes wish I could get Paul to stick his neck out a bit more, the guy, Garrad Hassan, that does the work. But when I'm here, I can say I know he gives me very cautious figures. So that's the wind factor. To get from capacities like this to the terawatt hours generated, you have to use a load factor. You have to have an understanding of how much of the year the wind is going to be blowing for, so how often, how many times that turbine blade is going to go around in the year. And the other thing that is very clear and conservative in the work is that he doesn't assume that the capacity factor will stay the same as it is now, at around 35%. He assumes that because in the future we will use less windy places, less good sites for wind farms, that the average for the whole stock, including the ones we've already got, will drop to 27%. So again, very conservative analysis. Hydro, just note, that doesn't include any new major hydro schemes. We're not talking about damming rivers that haven't been dammed. We're talking here about mainly small-scale schemes, often run-of-river hydro. And I'll just comment on biomass. The figures there are based on a 40% success rate for things that are in the system now, and as I think will become clear later, that's an area where I think it may be entirely reasonable, logical, to make that assumption, but not necessarily the right thing to do. So, turning those capacity figures into actual electricity generation in Scotland to 2030. This is the high renewable scenario, and what it shows is renewable generation growing to 20 gigawatts capacity, generating 65 terawatt hours. Now you'll remember that the demand for Scotland as a whole was 41 terawatt hours, potentially with some extra for heat and transport. That 65 isn't the top line on the graph. If you can see from there, the top line on the graph gets to nearly 85. That's because in the model, again being conservative, he's allowed some thermal capacity to remain on the system. That blue block at the bottom is basically Longannet Power Station and Peterhead Power Station. The reason it steps down in 2015 is that Cockenzie Power Station closes. The reason the big white block above it steps down rapidly in 2 steps is that Hunterston and Torness nuclear power stations close, as they are scheduled to do. That's what's assumed in this model. Even with that, there's significant growth in exports. What isn't included here that is worth pointing out is that because of the growth in renewables, it's actually likely that the remaining fossil plant at the bottom will be used less intensively throughout the year. So in reality, that line would slope downwards rather than run across in a stable way. The economics, basically, as they are currently foreseen, would favour the renewables. Is there anything else I would say on that one? The final note saying is if you take this scenario as it is shown, with that level of fossil fuel capacity still in there, then it would require carbon capture and storage on those 2 power stations for it to be decarbonised. Now, it's worth noting that those are the 2 power stations in Scotland with a credible plan for adopting carbon capture and storage. Indeed, Longannet is probably the most likely power station in the whole of the UK to have a commercial scale demonstration within the next 3 or 4 years. Peterhead will be so lucky remains to be seen.